I would like at the outset to congratulate all you and the team at NatureAfrica for making it through what has been globally a very difficult year. COVID-19 has caused havoc to the extent that we can only meet virtually, at least for the time being. 1 year of existence under the conditions of the coronavirus is something worthwhile to celebrate. Bravo, Team NatureNews Africa. The 26th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, COP26, meets in Glasgow this November 2021. The expectations are high, but I must add that it depends on one's perception of success when it comes to global negotiations on climate change. My anticipation is measured and is born out of a long experience of participating in a number of conferences of parties to the convention. I had the unenviable yet unique task of chairing the group of 133 plus countries, the group of 77, G77, and speaking for the G77 and China in 1997 during the negotiations which led to the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol, a multilateral instrument that was the precursor to the Paris Agreement. I worked very closely with such people as Mohamed Sanusi Bakindo from Nigeria, Leonardita Smula from the Philippines, Rungano Karimanzira from Zimbabwe, Mohamed Saleh Al-Saban of Saudi Arabia, Zhenmin Liu from China, and other delegates. My friend, colleague, and fellow university alumni, Abdoulaye Bathily, was then Minister of Environment of Senegal. Background. In 1985, scientists from across the world met in Villach, Austria, under the auspices of the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, and the International Council of Scientific Unions, ICSU, in order to discuss the greenhouse gases effect on the climate. They concluded that climate change was plausible and its occurrence a serious probability. From then onwards, a number of studies and meetings have supported the conclusions. Policies for the reduction of greenhouse gases, that is mitigation, and strategies to minimize the impact of climate change adaptation were proposed. These efforts led to the establishment of the International Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, in 1988, and the inception of World Climate Conferences. The United Nations took the lead in the matter, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed by 154 states in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, at the Earth Summit held in June 1992. The main objective of the convention is to achieve stabilization of greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. The objective has a time frame, and the time frame is that which is, and I quote, sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change, to ensure that food production is not threatened, and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner, end of quote. Through the convention structure, intergovernmental negotiations take place under its Conference of the Parties arrangements. The main objective of these negotiations is to arrive at a global consensus on the setting of and agreeing upon the temperature increase beyond which the Earth would be propelled into catastrophic circumstances, and how to adapt to the impacts of climate change that are now discernible. I attended the first conference of the parties, COP1, to the convention, which took place in Berlin in March to April 1995. Angela Merkel, the then Minister of the Federal Republic of Germany responsible for the environment, nature conservation, and nuclear safety, was the president of that particular first conference of the parties to the convention. The ongoing multilateral discussions on climate change have resulted from the decisions that were taken at COP1, and specifically decision COP1 of COP1, Decision 1, the Berlin Mandate. COP1, that is the first conference of the parties to the convention, reviewed the implementation by member states of their obligations under the convention and found them to be inadequate in the quest to stabilize the global climate system. The conference, therefore, decided to kickstart a process to strengthen the commitments of developed countries through the setting of quantified limitation and reduction objectives within specified timeframes. The conference was mindful of the global nature of climate change, which calls for widest possible cooperation by all countries and their participation in effective and appropriate international response in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and their respective capabilities and their social and economic conditions. The negotiations during the subsequent conferences of parties have centered on the review of the commitments and obligations of member states in furtherance of the objectives of the convention and informed by science. The foregoing provides the context for COP26, now meeting in Glasgow. The industrialized world is responsible for historic emissions concentrations. There's no doubt about that. The Kyoto Protocol did set quantified limitation and reduction objectives within specified timeframes for them. However, even at that early stage, it was realized that emerging nations such as China and India were on a trajectory to overtake developed countries in current emissions. The Paris Agreement has as its goal to limit global warming to well before 2 degrees, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. Greenhouse gas emissions peaking before and neutrality by 2050 rather, is central to the achievement of the temperature goal. Unlike the Kyoto Protocol, which targeted industrialized countries only in greenhouse gas emissions mitigation, the Paris Agreement embraces all nations within, of course, the remit of the convention. Poverty reduction is the paramount objective of Africa and developing countries in general. Climate change has become an added burden. Greenhouse gas emissions from them are minimal. For example, according to the Brookings Institute, Africa contributes about 3.8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Consequences of climate change, however, are more marked and more severe in developing countries due to their inability to meet the costs of vulnerability and adaptation. In the book I wrote in the aftermath of Kyoto, I referred to emissions by developing countries as survival emissions. That is, those emissions that are absolutely necessary to eradicate poverty and achieve sustainable development. The Paris Agreement adopts the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities among nations by recognizing that peaking and greenhouse gas emissions neutrality will take longer for developing countries to achieve, at least beyond 2050. Central in the discussions in Glasgow is the authenticity of goals set by industrial countries to attain peaking and neutrality. The phasing out of coal is bound to feature prominently. And in respect of coal, it will be interesting to hear the positions of Australia, Japan, China, India, and South Africa, among others. Low to zero carbon technologies and the transition to renewables and other solutions which are required in mitigating the effects of climate change will form an important part of the negotiations in Glasgow. It is worthwhile to bear in mind that the development and ownership of the technologies is largely the preserve of developed countries. Developing countries comprise of a disparate group. They include India and China, highly populated, huge economies, and high greenhouse gas emitting countries, the continent of Africa, and others. The classification also includes petroleum producing countries, mainly members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, and the associated petroleum producers. The main concern of the latter group, that's the oil producers, relates to the sustainability of the economies in the light of future drop in demand for petroleum. Small island states are highly vulnerable to sea water rise. They are, and rightly so, the conscience of the world when it comes to forcing the pace of the negotiations. They are likely to demand, as they've done before, and done so often, that drastic actions need to be undertaken urgently in order to avert a looming catastrophe. Many foreigners consider Africa to be a country. Perhaps it should be. But Africa is a huge continent comprising of over 55 countries of different sizes, geography, natural resources, wealth, and poverty levels. According to the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, 46 countries are categorized as least developing countries, LDCs. Of these, 33 countries are in Africa. Least developing countries, LDCs, are, and I quote, low-income countries confronting severe structural impediments to sustainable development. They are highly vulnerable to economic and environmental shocks and have low levels of human assets, end of quote. They include Angola, petroleum producing, OPEC member state, and mineral rich. The Democratic Republic of Congo, mineral rich and bearer of a large forest and carbon sink of global importance. Chad, Burkina Faso, Senegal, Mali, and other Sahelian countries. Burundi, Rwanda, Zambia, Malawi, and other landlocked countries. Eastern and Southern African states of Mozambique, Lesotho, Tanzania, Uganda, South Sudan, Somalia, and Ethiopia. And the small island states such as Sao Tome and Principe and the Comoros. Manifestations of long-term climate impacts in Africa include the steady expansion of the Sahara Desert, the shrinking of Lake Chad by a staggering 95% between 1963 and 1998, severe floods of the Sudan and Southern Sudan, the drying up of the Lake Fagubuine system in Mali, the disappearance of Maziwe Island in the Indian Ocean in coastal Tanzania, and the recession of the glacier on Mount Kilimanjaro, and other local impacts. Internecine conflicts are now more and more climate-related, taking the form of clashes between cattle herders and farmers. Africa has been resilient to disasters, human-induced and natural. These have included slave trade, colonialism, internecine wars, and pandemics. African populations have over centuries shown resilience to climate variability. However, climate change resulting from human-induced global warming is upsetting their patterns and their livelihoods. Water scarcity and the resulting food insecurity are indicators of climate variability and climate change. Water scarcity calls for efficient management of transboundary and internal water basins. The mantra in respect of water conservation and management should be more produce per less drop of water. Adaptation to climate change has to be the priority of African governments at national and the local level. Climate change should not be treated as a subject or a discipline that requires a separate consideration. It should be part of sustainable development. Mainstreaming climate change throughout the entire economy is imperative. In doing so, issues such as governance, poverty alleviation, equity, self-sufficiency, self-reliance, indigenous knowledge, capacity building, and technology development and cooperation become important considerations in meeting the challenges posed by global warming and the resulting climate change. A financial mechanism has been established through the Paris Agreement framework in order to assist developing countries build the resilience to adapt to the impacts of climate change. Africa, however, has to be wary of the prospect of benefiting from the arrangement that I've just mentioned. Examples of developed countries reneging on their commitments are many. Through the United Nations and the Monterey Consensus in particular, They have committed to set aside 0.7% of their gross national product, GNP, for development assistance to developing countries, and 0.15 to 0.2% to least developing countries. Thus far, only a handful have managed to do so. If the global COVID-19 vaccination and vaccine disparity and inequity are anything to go by, and in order to create resilience and adaptation to climate change, Africa has no choice but to pull itself out of its own bootstraps. Let me end in the same manner that I started, by congratulating Aliu and Team NatureNews Africa. It has been a singular honor that I had to be invited to present the first anniversary lecture. Let us wish for ourselves Godspeed in our endeavors. I thank you.